This is episode 2 of the real life series we made about real life serial killers. The series is called The Real Life Monsters, and we are going through the monsters Richard Evanitz, Jeffrey Dahmer, and
not revealed one yet.
Before we start, we'd like to tell everyone that this isn't 100% the truth of what happened. We decided to trick and change some dynamic in the stories to make it sound more creepy and more like a story than real life. Now, let's dive into the story.
Obs! Before you start watching this video, you should really go in to listen to episode 1 before you listen to this, or you might not understand what this series is about. So, well, with that said, let's jump into the video.
Part 1. The serial killer named Jeffrey Dahmer. Bath Township, Ohio, in 1978. A young man named Jeffrey Dahmer sat in his car driving on the road. When he spotted a guy hitchhiking, Dahmer decided to stop and give the guy a ride.
Hey, you look like you need a ride. Where are you going to?
Hey, I'm going to a festival with my friends. It's an hour away by car, so I decided to hitchhike. Did I get a ride?
Jeff was a weird man. He didn't have any real friends, and were kinda bad at talking to people. He sat there and thought to himself, but after a short minute, he looked back at Steven.
Alright, I have a condition. I was just driving home to grab a beer and do some workout. I could drive you to the concert if you follow me home for a while.
Sure.
I'm Jeff.
I'm Steven. Nice to meet you.
The hitchhiker jumped in the car. He drove home. They arrived at Jeffrey's house, a quiet and isolated place hidden from the busy streets of Bath Township. The tension in the air was thick, but Steven, eager to make his way to the concert, remained oblivious to the true danger he was now walking into. Inside, the house was eerily silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Jeffrey grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge, offering one to Steven.
Here, let's relax for a bit before I take you to that concert.
Steven hesitated for a moment, but accepted the beer. He glanced around the house. Everything seemed in order, but something felt off. The quiet was unsettling, as if the walls themselves were watching.
Thanks, man. So, how long you been living here?
My whole life. Never really left.
As they sat in the dimly lit living room, Jeffrey's gaze never left Steven. He watched him intently, his mind racing with thoughts that would make any normal person's blood run cold. Steven, however, was still unaware of the growing danger. But then, there was a shift, a movement, something deeper than the silence itself.
You know, it's funny. Most people don't just stop by here. It's always so quiet. Almost too quiet.
Steven gave a nervous laugh, unsure how to respond. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the unease growing in the back of his mind. But before he could process it, Jeffrey stood up abruptly.
Hey, I wanted to show you something real quick. It's in the garage. You mind?
Steven blinked, hesitating for the first time since he'd accepted the ride. There was something unsettling about the way Jeffrey said it. Casual, but with a hidden edge. Still, he shrugged it off. A ride to the concert was a ride, after all.
Sure, what is it?
Jeffrey motioned for Steven to follow him. The house felt darker now, each shadow more pronounced as they walked through the narrow hallway to the garage. When they reached it, the air was thick, heavy with a strange metallic scent.
It's just in here.
He pushed open the door, revealing a cluttered space. Tools hung from the walls, and in the center of the room was an old weight bench. There was nothing particularly strange about the room itself, but the vibe was wrong. Everything felt too deliberate, too organized, like it was set up for something bad. Stephen's instincts flared, but before he could react, Jeffrey's hand clamped down on his shoulder. His grip was strong, stronger than Stephen expected.
You work out, Stephen?
Stephen, trying to keep the conversation light, nodded, but his voice cracked slightly.
Yeah, sometimes.
That's when Jeffrey's voice took on a darker tone.
Good. That means you can handle this.
In one swift movement, Jeffrey pushed Stephen down onto the weight bench. The suddenness of the action knocked the breath from Stephen's lungs. Panic set in as he realized that the door to the escape was now behind him, blocked by the figure looming over him. But there was no escape now. The silence of the house felt oppressive, suffocating as Stephen's pulse quickened. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to fight back, to run, to do something. But Jeffrey was relentless, eyes wide with a disturbing calmness.
What the hell, man? Let me go!
It'll all be over soon. Just stay still. I'm sorry. I just need this.
Stephen thrashed, his muscles straining against the cuffs, but it was no use. As Jeffrey loomed closer, his voice dropped to a whisper. Jeffrey Dahmer stood over him, lost in the depths of his own madness. In a swift motion, Jeffrey smacked Stephen's head with a weight. Stephen laid there. He died on the impact. Jeffrey sat on top of Stephen for a while, before he started to panic. He tried waking Stephen up, and he realized what he had done. After futile attempts to wake Stephen up, Jeffrey decided to hide the body. The lifeless body of Stephen lay on the cold concrete floor, and Jeffrey sat beside it, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. Panic set in, creeping through every nerve of his body. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there was a grim sense of satisfaction, a twisted fulfillment of the dark desires that had plagued his mind for years. For a long time, Jeffrey just stared at the body, unsure of what to do next. His mind raced between the reality of the situation and the chaotic thoughts swirling inside him. The enormity of what he'd done began to sink in.
I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for it to go this far.
But it had gone this far, and there was no going back now. Jeffrey's thoughts quickly shifted from guilt to practicality. He couldn't leave the body here. Someone would find it, and if they found Stephen, they would now find him. Jeffrey stood, pacing back and forth, his eyes flickering between the body and the door. He couldn't let anyone know. He wouldn't let anyone know. The panic, though ever present, began to morph into his cold determination. He had to clean up the mess. He had to make this disappear. He made his way to the kitchen, rummaging through drawers until he found what he needed. Garbage bags, knives, and cleaning supplies. His hands trembled as he carried them back to the garage, but there was no turning back now. With mechanical precision, Jeffrey began the grisly task of dismembering Stephen's body. His face was a mask of emotionless focus, as if disconnecting himself from the horror of what he was doing. The only sounds that filled the garage were the sickening noises of flesh and bone being cut, and the occasional scrape of metal against the floor. Hours passed, and the once intact body of Stephen Hicks was now in pieces, neatly packed into black garbage bags. The sight should have horrified him, but Jeffrey felt a strange sense of control, a sense of power. In his twisted mind, this act made him feel safe, if only for the moment.
No one will find him. No one will ever know.
But the truth was, this was only the beginning. Jeffrey didn't know it yet, but the dark part of him, the part that he had tried to keep buried for so long, was awake now. It was hungry, and it wouldn't be satisfied with just this one act. With the bags in hand, Jeffrey moved quickly, glancing around the empty streets as he loaded them into the back of his car. His mind was still racing, but now it was focused. He drove out to a secluded area, deep into the woods. It was a place he had visited before, a place where he felt isolated, safe. Under the cover of darkness, he buried what was left of Stephen Hicks. The soil absorbed the evidence of his first kill. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the scene, as if the earth itself was bearing witness to the unspeakable act. With the body buried and the tools cleaned, Jeffrey returned home. The silence of the house was deafening. He sat in his living room, alone, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him. But this time, it wasn't panic that filled his mind. It was something darker, something that whispered to him that this wasn't over, that this was just the beginning. He stared at the empty beer cans on the table, remembering the fleeting moments of normalcy he had shared with Stephen. A smile, a conversation, but that was gone now. That part of him was gone.
I am in control. I have to be.
And for the first time, Jeffrey Dahmer felt powerful. The darkness within him had been unleashed, and there was no telling where it would lead. But one thing was certain. There would be more victims, more bodies, more secrets buried in the shadows. The real-life monster had been born, and no one knew it yet, not even Jeffrey Dahmer himself. Jeffrey Dahmer, some decades later, started killing people, but now with purpose. And in the 1990s, something terrible happened yet again. Dahmer walked outside off a liquor store and spotted a boy standing outside.
Hey, can I buy you a drink? What you want?
Sure. I'll take a beer.
Sure. Stay here.
Dahmer walked inside, bought the beer, and somehow managed to get Konerak to follow him into his apartment. Once inside, he gave Konerak a glass of beer that he secretly had laced drugs in. He sat down next to Konerak, and they began having their conversation.
So, how old are you?
14.
14. Oh.
The dim light of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment flickered slightly as he stared at Konerak, the 14-year-old boy sitting on his couch, sipping the drug-laced beer. The room was small, cluttered, and yet felt like a trap. The stale air clinging to every corner, heavy with something far more sinister than just the smell of alcohol.
Yeah, I'm 14. But I look older, huh?
Yeah. You do.
Jeffrey's voice was soft, almost too soft, as if he were trying to lull the boy into a false sense of security. But behind his eyes, a storm was brewing. He couldn't stop thinking about what he would do next. His mind had already made the decision, but there was a process, a ritual, that had to be followed. He glanced at Konerak, watching as the boy's movements became sluggish, the drugs beginning to take effect.
You comfortable? You look tired.
Yeah. I feel kinda dizzy. I don't feel good.
Just relax. You'll be okay. I'm gonna take care of you.
Konerak's voice trailed off as he slumped further into the couch. His body betrayed him as the drugs took hold. He looked around the room with confusion, trying to focus on something, anything, but his vision blurred. Jeffrey, calm and collected, reached out to steady him, placing a hand on his shoulder. But nothing about this situation was okay. and deep down, Konerak knew it. His instincts screamed at him, but his body was betraying his will. As the room spun, he felt Jeffrey's hands tighten around him, guiding him toward the bedroom. The world fading in and out of focus with every step. Once inside, the scene shifted to something even darker. The bedroom was sparse, with little more than a mattress on the floor and a few scattered objects that spoke of Jeffrey's chaotic mind. He carefully lowered Konerak onto the mattress, his facial expressions lost in the moment.
You're mine now.
The words were barely audible now, his body nearly limp from the drugs. Jeffrey watched, his heart pounding at his chest, as the boy's breathing grew shallow. But instead of panic, there was excitement, a twisted sense of purpose. He reached out, brushing the hair from Konerak's forehead, his eyes locked on the boy's unconscious form. And just like that, Jeffrey Dahmer's chilling routine began once again. Hours passed, and the drugs had done their job. Konerak lay still, completely unconscious as Jeffrey prepared for what he planned to do next. But even in this monstrous state, there was a cruel irony to what happened next. An opportunity for escape, for salvation, that came and went in the blink of an eye. Just after midnight, there was a knock at the door. Jeffrey's blood ran cold. For a moment, he froze, his heart pounding against his ribcage. He wasn't expecting anyone. Panic flooded his mind as he realized the precariousness of his situation. His apartment was a crime scene, and Konerak was still alive, albeit barely. If anyone found out, everything would unravel. He quickly left the bedroom, pulling the door shut behind him. The knocking continued, more insistent now. Jeffrey took a deep breath, forcing a calm expression as he walked toward the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway were two police officers.
Oh, good evening. We got a call from a couple of women in the neighborhood. They said they saw a young boy running around out here. Looked like he might have been in trouble. Do you know anything about that?
Oh, yeah. That was my boyfriend. He's just had a little too much to drink. You know how it is. I've got everything under control now. He's in the bedroom sleeping it off.
Your boyfriend? How old is that young boy?
He's 19. He just looks young for his age.
The officers exchanged glances. Behind them, a couple of concerned neighbors stood in the hallway, whispering to each other. The air was tense, the kind of tension that feels like a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. But somehow, Jeffrey kept his composure. He played the part of a worried boyfriend, convincing the officers that everything was under control. One of the officers even took a glance inside the apartment, peering past Jeffrey into the living room, but it looked normal, too normal. Against all odds, the officers seemed satisfied.
All right, just keep an eye on him. Make sure he's okay. Je totally go, man.
And with that, they turned to leave. For a brief moment, Jeffrey allowed himself to breathe again. He had come so close to being caught, to everything coming crashing down around him. But somehow, by sheer manipulation and the incompetence of these two meant to protect the innocent, he had gotten away with it. As he shut the door behind him, Jeffrey turned back toward the bedroom. The adrenaline rush still pulsed through his veins, but now it was mixed with something darker, a sense of invincibility. He had slipped through the cracks once again, and now there was no turning back. But for Konerak, there was no second chance, no escape. The night stretched on as the drugs fully took hold. His fate was sealed, his life slipping away in the hands of one of history's most infamous monsters. Jeffrey Dahmer was far from finished, and this was just another chapter in his growing legacy of horror. (1991), July 22nd, at a local gay bar, Dahmer walked up to his next victim. It was the 32-year-old Tracy Edwards.
Hey, one beer, thanks. And one too for my new friend here.
Tracy looked over at Jeffrey, who flashed a polite smile. He appeared normal, maybe a little shy, but there was something disarming about his awkwardness. Tracy, out to have a good time, accepted the drink with a nod, not realizing he had just taken the first step into a nightmare.
Thanks, man. What's your name?
Jeff. Nice to meet you.
As the night wore on, the two shared small talk, blending into the crowded bar. But, as usual, Jeffrey had one goal in mind, luring Tracy back to his apartment. After a few drinks, he leaned in closer, his voice low, almost conspiratorial.
Hey, you should come back to my place. I've got some cool stuff there. Drinks? Movies? We could hang out for a bit.
Yeah, sure, man. Sounds fun.
Tracy hesitated for a moment. Something about Jeffrey felt off, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The drinks had loosened him up. The offer seemed harmless enough. Besides, it was just a short trip. The decision was made, and with that, they left the bar, disappearing into the quiet streets of Milwaukee. The walk to Jeffrey's apartment was brief, but heavy with an unspoken tension, one that Tracy couldn't yet sense, but would soon come to regret. When they arrived at the apartment, the smell hit Tracy immediately. It was a sharp, metallic odor mixed with something rotting, though Jeffrey tried to cover it with cheap air fresheners. Inside the apartment was cluttered, but nothing overtly alarming at first glance.
What's that smell?
Just some bad meat I forgot in the fridge. Don't worry, it's fine. You want a drink?
Tracy's instincts flared, but he suppressed them. After all, it was late, and he was already there. He nodded, taking the drink Jeffrey handed him, though something felt wrong. As they sat on the couch, Jeffrey put on a movie, but his eyes kept drifting toward Tracy. His thoughts, dark and obsessive, began to spiral.
You alright, man? You keep staring at me.
Just thinking. You ever pose for pictures? I'm a bit of a photographer and you've got a look.
The request was bizarre, but before Tracy could respond, Jeffrey's demeanor shifted. The atmosphere grew thick, charged with danger. Jeffrey's gaze darkened as he suddenly reached behind the couch, pulling out a pair of handcuffs.
Whoa! What are you doing, man?
Jeffrey lunged, snapping one cuff onto Tracy's wrist before he could fully react. Tracy's heart pounded in his chest as adrenaline surged through him. He shoved Jeffrey back with all of his strength, knocking him off balance.
Get off of me!
Panic set in, but Tracy was not like the others. Fueled by fear and survival instinct, he fought harder than Jeffrey had anticipated. He scrambled to his feet, yanking on the cuff still dangling from one wrist. Jeffrey, momentarily stunned, watched as Tracy made a break for the door. In a desperate rush, Tracy darted out of the apartment and into the hallway, his pulse racing, his mind spinning. This wasn't just a close call, this was life or death. Tracy ran as fast as his legs would carry him, pounding down the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, Jeffrey didn't follow, paralyzed by the realization that he had lost control of the situation. Outside, Tracy burst into the street, still handcuffed, his shirt torn, his face etched with pure terror. And then, as if by a stroke of fate, he spotted two police officers.
Help! Help me! That man up there, he tried to kill me.
The officers immediately took notice, alarmed by Tracy's disheveled appearance and the handcuff dangling from his wrist. They listened as he recounted the horrifying events that had just transpired inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment.
Stay here. We'll check it out, okay?
Tracy watched as the officers made their way up to the apartment, his heart still racing in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but he had just become the catalyst for the unraveling of one of America's most notorious killers. Inside the apartment, the officers were greeted by an eerily calm Jeffrey Dahmer. But behind the facade, the cracks were beginning to show. The officers questioned him briefly, but then their eyes fell on something far more disturbing. A series of photographs scattered on a table. Photographs of dismembered bodies. The nightmare was over, at least for Tracy Edwards. But for Jeffrey Dahmer, the horrors he had committed were about to be fully exposed to the world. The police would soon uncover the true extent of his evil, finding body parts in his apartment, frozen remains, and chilling evidence of the monstrous acts that had taken place behind closed doors. This was the moment when the reign of terror came to an end, when Jeffrey Dahmer, the real-life monster, was finally caught. But the scars he left behind on his victims and their families would never fully heal. The darkness that had consumed him had been extinguished, but the stories of his unspeakable crimes will live on, haunting the memories of those who survived and those who could not. This was the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, one of the real-life monsters who walked among us, hidden in plain sight, the kind of evil that doesn't wear a mask but smiles at you from across a bar, offering you a drink.
I content that your drinking eyes never open. I insist somebody will die, and I hate hoping. Wishing that the pills let you cry, and I hate coping. Someday I will go back outside and see her okay. I content that your drinking eyes never open. I insist somebody will die, and I hate hoping. Wishing that the pills let you cry, and I hate hoping. Someday I will go back outside.